The entire Brit Chadasha, the renewed covenant, depends on the revelation of the Pesach, which is called the Passover, and Hagmatzot, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. After all, we all have heard that the Messiah, Mashiach Yahushua, was called the Lamb of YaHuWaH. And how can we possibly understand what it means to be the Lamb of YaHuWaH without the proper context? That is why it is so important to study the Pesach. We know that Yahushua HaMashiach is the Lamb of YaHuWaH who is slain, who was put to death and executed on the 14th of Abib. This is important because this is the time when the Passover lambs were sacrificed. According to the Torah, as we have already studied, the lamb is sacrificed for the Pesach on the 14th of the first month, which is the month of Abib. And it is sacrificed ben ha'arabim, between the evenings, which is historically called the 9th hour, according to a sundial, which makes it roughly 3 p.m. on Roman time. So therefore, at the exact moment that the lamb was slain for the Pesach, Yahushua gave up his ruach. He died at the 9th hour, according to the testimonies of the writings of the Bashar, which is called the glad tidings, which are Matthew, Matityahu, Mark, Marcus, Lucas, Luke, and Yochanan, which is called John. And if we study all of the records, we see clearly he was slain on the preparation day of the Pesach. But one of the most important aspects of the Messiah, the Mashiach, that we must understand is that he kept the Torah, because it is prophesied throughout the Torah that Shiloh, or is called Shiloh, shall come. And when he comes, he will rule and reign. And we know that he will be the conquering lion of Yehudah, who is prophesied to come. So therefore, we must understand that when he walked the earth, he kept the Pesach, he kept the Torah, he taught his students, his Talmudim, to observe the Pesach, the Passover. They never stopped keeping the Passover. His students were called Natzarim, after the word Natsar, which Yahushua was called Hanatzari. Hanatzari referred to not only the city called Nazareth, which was of Galil, which he spent a lot of his time growing up in. Not where he was born. He was born in Bethlehem. But he grew up there, and so therefore he was called Hanatzari. But he was also called Hanatzari because in the scriptures, the word Natsar is a key word that refers to the Mashiach, to the Messiah. And so his students were called Natzarim because they were offshoots from the same tree. They believed in the Mashiach, and they were his fruits. They were his students who learned at his feet, who learned all of the principles of YaHuWaH found in his Torah, and they observed the Passover. And so therefore it must be understood, when people try to say that the early believers were Christians, they have a false understanding of the scriptures, because it says in the scriptures, in the book of Acts, that it was the Greeks who first called the Nazarim Christians. You know, Christians refers to Christos, which is the name that was used for fallen deities such as Zeus and all types of, I'm not even going to name the names, you get the idea. The point is that in the Greek culture, this was not a special title. It was not the equivalent, it's not necessarily the equivalent of Mashiach, a Messiah. It does not mean the exact same thing. And so therefore we have to understand that the early believers, they were all Hebrews. They were all from the tribe of Yehudah and Benjamin and Levi. They all came forth from Yahuwah's own people. And it was much later that the Gentiles began to believe in large numbers. So we know that there were many Gentiles who believed in Yahushua. We read about that in scriptures. Who Gentiles, again, that word is actually vague. I should describe it actually. The word Gentile is actually goyim. Goyim means from the nations. So it means from another nation outside of the tribes of YaHuWaH, which are the tribes of Yasharel, the 12 tribes. But again, historically, at this time that Yahushua walked the earth, only the southern tribes were still in the land. And so that, that context has to be understood as well. So therefore, he was reaching out and looking for the lost sheep of Yasharel because they had been dispersed. It's all context. And so he taught the Passover, he lived the Passover, and it can be verified through Shaul's writings, who's called Paul. Now, I know that in Christianity and in most modern understanding of the first century, Shaul, who is called Paul, he is attributed as being the founder of Christianity. A lot of people would argue and say that the Messiah was, but nonetheless, they would say that, they base most of their beliefs upon this man who we know to be Shaul. In the proper context, Shaul was raised a Pharisee. He says this over and over and over. Of course, he was of the Nazarene. He believed in Yahushua. But he was raised a Pharisee at the feet of Gamliel. We've already talked about all these things. And he taught people to return to the way. The way is Yahuwah's word. It is his Torah, it is his prophets, it is his writings, all the things that come from the inspiration of Yahuwah's Ruach HaKodesh, his breath. So therefore, if we were to look at Shaul's writings, instead of just listening to what people say he said, if we were to stop listening to people cut and paste different things he said and try to splice them all together and make some type of doctrine out of it. If we didn't do that, instead read it in a historical context, we would understand that the man was a Torah teacher. Because in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, now what has to be noted also is this is speaking not only to Hebrews here, but to a mixed congregation in Corinth, the Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6, he says, your boasting is not tov. It is not great or excellent or, I guess, good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the entire lump? Therefore, cleanse out the old leaven, so that you are a new lump, as you are unleavened. For also Mashiach, Messiah, our Passover, our Pesach, was offered for us. So then let us observe the festival. If you are one of those people who like to underline things, this might be something you would like to underline. I particularly don't write in my scriptures, but this is important to note. I mean, at least write it down, the reference. Because in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, Shaul, who's called Paul by the Christians, says, observe the Passover. Yet you will not see any of the thousands of denominations of Christianity observing the Passover. And if they do, they defile it by using blasphemous names and terminology such as God and Zeus and things like that, which we're not going to say anymore throughout this video. Because those words all refer to other deities throughout the scriptures. So therefore, it is not done in the proper way. And so if they are learning, then that's great. I know there are many people who were in or are in the Christian faith who are coming out and observing Yahuwah's true ways. So that is truth. But if you read the scriptures, instead of just going off what people have said, you will see that the man who was called Shaul kept the Torah, he kept the prophets, he kept the Shabbat, he observed Passover, and he told the people who listened to him that they should also keep the Passover, because Yahushua, our Passover, our Pesach, the Messiah, was sacrificed for us. So therefore, we know that Yahushua died on the 14th of Abib at the 9th hour, at the very time that the Passover was sacrificed, and therefore Shaul automatically knew that the Messiah was a picture of the Passover, having died on the Passover. And here, of course, he likens the idea of leavening to maliceness and wickedness. He says, He says that we should observe the feast. So then let us observe the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of evil and of wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So here he's given us a spiritual application, an application that we can see something deeper. What was the purpose, the intent behind the idea of purging the house of the leaven? Leaven contaminates whatever it comes into contact with. When we're talking about dough, it contaminates the dough. And therefore, when it does, it changes it. It changes it forever. It will never be the same after it is come into contact with leaven. It will begin to rise and puff up and puff up and puff up. And we know, of course, that this is a picture of maliceness and wickedness. When people come into contact with it, it may little by little begin to rub off on them. You may hear that their personality changes, their lingo changes, the way that they carry themselves change, and on and on and on. You will see that it becomes more and more profound. And so that is what happens with sin. And so here Shaul is telling us that we are to teshuvah, we're to return, to turn back from that sin and wickedness, purge it out of the home, and celebrate this festival with sincerity and truth, not just purging physical leaven, but also understanding the heart of the matter. So Shaul, he actually taught that the Bashar, the glad tidings, is that Yahushua is the Passover Lamb. So if anybody says that Yahushua didn't die on the Passover, on the Pesach, they do not understand the Bashar, and they have taken away from the revelation. The scriptures say that there will be people who will come with a different revelation of the Messiah. They will come and teach a different glad tidings. Now, I'm not saying that all the people who've got mixed up on this have got mixed up because they just, they're just lost altogether. Some people, they just get confused. But there are some people who just will not believe what the book says, and the book speaks very clearly. For instance, if we go and we look at Mark chapter 15, it says in Mark chapter 15, it was the preparation day. That is the day before the Shabbat. And we know that this is the time that Yahushua died. It said it was the preparation day. The first century terminology for preparation day of the Sabbath here is talking about the preparation day of the Passover. And how do we know this? Because we have to look at all the accounts. We have 4 accounts of Yahushua's life, death, and resurrection. 2 of those accounts come from Yahushua's own students, namely Matthew, which is Matithyahu, and John, which is Yahukanan. And these 2 men actually walked with Yahushua, talked with Yahushua, saw all of his signs and wonders. And then we have Marcus and Lucas, whom we don't really know how much they actually saw and observed of Yahushua, but we do know that they were actually students of Shaul, of Paul. And so they got the revelation from the taught ones of Yahushua themselves. And when you look at all the information, you see that every account might have a little different information. It doesn't necessarily mean what people say that it means that, well, there's these differences. Why are there these differences? But if you look at the differences and you parallel them out, especially if you get confused and need in the English, it's very helpful to go back into the Hebrew, the Aramaic, even the Greek, and to try to figure out, what exactly is being said. And if you do that and you look at all 4 accounts, you see that what happens is they're summarizing the key points of Yahushua's life and of his death and resurrection. And we know this because in the text itself, it says that if they had written everything that Yahushua had said and done, that they would not be able to contain all the scrolls. Even the world wouldn't be able to contain the scrolls. And so therefore, they summarized the high points, the important parts. So we must know that when we see that one person says that he said this part, and then we see that he said this part, and you put it together, what you see is that he said both things. It's a flow, that's going on. And so if we keep that in mind and we do our studies the way that they're supposed to be done with the Bashar, with the glad tidings, and we look at all the accounts, and we go to the book of Matthew. Matthew makes it abundantly obvious. But first, I'm going to look at an example in Matthew, which is Matithyahu, that may not be so obvious. And this is one that you definitely want to note. You definitely want to Write this down, take this down. This is important because in the book of Matityahu, in chapter 27, verse 15, it says, "And at the festival, the governor used to release for the crowd one prisoner whom they desired." And of course, we know this is talking about when Yahushua was brought out, and he was brought out with the man who we have known as Barabbas or Barabbas, and he was brought out that there were people in the crowd, and we know if you look at the actual place where this took place, you will see that only a few hundred people could fit in this square where Yahushua was actually brought out by Pilate, before all the people. So the people that had filled this square already knew what was happening. A lot of the other people had no idea that Yahushua was about to be killed. They had just seen him bring Lazarus, back from the dead. They were rejoicing because he was coming to Jerusalem. They were excited. They believed that he was the conquering lion of Yehuda. He was going to restore the kingdom. He was going to overthrow the Romans. And now all of a sudden, randomly, he was brought by night and nobody knew that he was even having a trial. And then he's going to be killed the very next day. What's going on? People, they don't really understand that Yahushua had thousands of followers. Thousands of followers. If we actually look at the context of the historical Yahushua, according to the scriptures and according to the history itself, Yahushua was called a rabbi. Now, he said that only he should be called rabbi because the word rab comes from the word which means chief or chief one. And so therefore, when we say rabbi, we're saying literally my chief one. And so Yahushua was a rabbi, and therefore he had students, Talmudim, and he had 12. And within those 12, he had 3 special students that he would take and teach things that he didn't teach the rest, and show them the special things. And there's all kinds of examples of that. But a lot of people don't realize that he also appointed 72 others, and he sent them out to actually do signs and wonders to proclaim his coming into the various cities. And a lot of people don't take into account that at any given time, we know that thousands of people were constantly following Yahushua because he was able to feed them and sustain them. We know that at any given moment, he could break bread, just a few loaves and a few fish, and feed thousands of people. He did this at least twice in the Bashar writings, we know, and maybe even more that weren't recorded. And so there were thousands of people following him. They did not realize that there was a trial going on. They didn't know that he was being nailed to the stake. Everything was very confusing. The only people who knew were the people who were participating. They filled this crowd and they began to cry out to choose not Yahushua, but Barabbas, and nail Yahushua to the stake. Not all the Yahudim were against Yahushua. This is what Christianity tries to say, that the Yahudim, what they call the Jews who killed Yahushua. It was a few corrupt Yahudim that can't speak for the entire nation. And not only that, but it was the Romans who nailed Yahushua to the stake. That has to be understood. It doesn't matter. Pilate may have washed his hands, but it was still the Roman beast system that destroyed the Mashiach, as was prophesied by the book of Daniel by Daniel before it even happened. So all this, again, very critical to have an understanding of the first century, what was happening in the day and age. And if we look in the book of Matityahu in the Hebrew, it doesn't just say that it was the day of the festival like we read. It says, if we read it in a regular translation, Matityahu 27:15, again, it says, "And at the festival, the governor used to release to the crowd one prisoner." But in the Hebrew Matityahu, which we have several manuscripts of, which I myself have seen with my own eyes and looked at and examined. I mean, these are things that people can actually see today. This is the amount of knowledge that's going out into the world. There's all types of resources available. Now, this Hebrew Matthew and the Hebrew Matthews that are available are not necessarily the original Hebrew Matthew. They date to the 15th and 13th century, and they were found amongst Yahudi. And they were written in Hebrew letters. And we know that these are a transmission. They do have a Hebrew source that they're being transmitted from. There's no doubt, no question about it. You can see it in the wordplay. You can see it in the grammar. You can see it in the melody. There's a lot of poetry that is being said, where there's a lot of rhythm and rhyming amongst the words of Yahushua when he's speaking his parables. There's no way that it's happen chance. And if we go and look at these Hebrew Matthews, we'll see in this particular verse, it says that it was the esteemed day of the Passover. It doesn't just say it was the day of the festival. It literally says it's the esteemed day of the Passover. In the Hebrew, it reads, Wabayom Chachag Henikabod Shel Pesach. Wabayom, again, in the day, Chachag of the festival, Hanikabod, the esteemed shell means of the Pesach, which is the Passover. So in the Hebrew Matthew, there can be no doubt whatsoever that Yahushua was betrayed on the day which is called the Passover, when the lambs were to be sacrificed, the esteemed day of the Passover. And if we look in other places, such as in Matityahu chapter 27. And this account is actually quite clear in the translations. In Matthew 27, verse 62, it says, the next day, which was the day after the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered to Pilate. And here they came the day after the preparation, which in context is clearly the day after Yahushua died, which was the day of the preparation. So they came the next day and they came to Pilate and they said that they wanted to have guards, Roman guards, put around the tomb because Yahushua had said that he would raise 3 days and 3 nights later. If we go to Lucas chapter 23, verse 53, we get a little more insight. It says it was the preparation day and the Sabbath was approaching. And we know the Sabbath was approaching because it was in the evening and it was the time that the sun was beginning. It was going to be setting soon. And it was time for the festival of Passover and the beginning of unleavened bread, because they had to eat the Passover that night. There was a lot of rushing that had to be done because of all the events that were taking place. There was a special Sabbath approaching, and we know it was a special Sabbath according to YaHuWaH, or John's testimony of the events. It should also be noted that in the first century, the first day of unleavened bread was called a Shabbat Hagadol. It was also called a Shabbaton sometimes. It is very common for it to be referred to as a Shabbat, the first and the last day of unleavened bread. However, technically in the Torah, it is never called a Shabbat, nor a Shabbaton. But this is important for us to understand because here the writers in the Bashar, when they refer to this day, they call it a Shabbat because of the first century lingo that they were using. So hopefully that will clear up any type of confusion. In YaHuWaH chapter 19, it says in verse 14, and it was the preparation day of the Passover week. Now, of course, Passover is not eaten for an entire week, but the Feast of Unleavened Bread lasts for a week. So therefore, what it's speaking of is the fact that there will be Passover, and then there's a week of celebration. So here it just calls it the Passover week. It's not there because it's erroneous to say, it's there because that's the lingo of the first century. This is the way people spoke. People would oftentimes refer to the Passover as an entire week because there was an entire celebration attached to the day of the Passover. So it says it was the preparation day of the Passover week. So that gives us clear insight that the preparation day of the Passover week, if you're preparing for the week, you're on the 14th. Because the 15th begins the 7 days, which is the week of unleavened bread. So here it is clearly telling us it is on the 14th of Abib, the same day that the lambs have to be slain. And again, we note the very hour, Yahushua died at the 9th hour, the very time that the Passover lamb was slain. So it was the preparation day of the Passover week, about the 6th hour, is what it says in the book of YaHuWaH. I have to clear up something really quick, and as we look at some more of the passages, we'll see that this is true. But here, Yahuchanan, who's called John, is actually using Roman time. And there's a reason for that. Uh, it has to be understood, though, because in the context, this is around 6 in the morning, and Romans begin their count at 12. We know that it's not the 6th hour of the day because if we look at all the other accounts, it is clear by logical deduction that this is him speaking of Roman time. Because even though he was speaking to Yahudim, it was the Romans were the oppressors. The Romans had enforced their system on the people, and they were very familiar with Roman time. So it's actually not that strange to see. If we were to look at the Aramaic testimony of Yahuchanan, of John, in chapter 19, verse 31, it says, therefore, since it was the preparation day, that the body should not remain on the stake on the Shabbat, for that Shabbat was a high one. Now that is what all the translations say unanimously, that that Sabbath was a high one. But in Aramaic, it says Rabba Yoma de Shabbata, which literally means it is the chief day of the Sabbath, which is an idiomatic expression used in the first century that refers to the high festival days. So it is referring to the high festival day of unleavened bread, when the Passover meal is to be consumed, the Rabba Yoma de Shabbata, the chief day of the Sabbath. Now, we also have to understand these events in the context of the first century. So we need to take a journey mentally back to this time when Yahushua was observing the Passover, when he was walking the earth, so that we can understand the Bashar, so we can understand the glad tidings, so that we can understand the Lamb of YaHuWaH, so we can get that proper understanding and be rejuvenated by the truth and not the falsehood and the lie, which does not tell us about Yahushua's sacrifice happening on the Passover, which wants to ignore these facts and replace it with mythical ideas such as Easter bunnies and various all types of idolatry. There are people out there who say that we should not keep the Passover, even though Yahushua HaMashiach did. And there's all kinds of things that are being said. But we need to understand the first century time period, because if we do, we will have a key that will unlock a depth of revelation that would just change your whole understanding forever. Because then you will understand how inspired the scriptures truly are when you really get a depth of what is going on. Because historically, Yahushua came into Jerusalem on the 10th day of Abib. Now, this is important, very much so. And another thing that must be noted, as people are coming home to Jerusalem during this time period to celebrate the Passover, because it is a Torah law, actually, it is instructed that all those who are of Yasharel must come back to Jerusalem if they live, and no matter where they live in the land, they must come to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. And historically, at this time, there are only 100,000 residents in the land of Yehudah. Because if we understand the time period, the northern kingdoms, which were the 10 northern tribes of Yasharel, have been sent into the Assyrian captivity, and they have not returned to this very day. And at the time, Yehudah had already experienced their exile. The southern tribes, which are called the house of Yehudah or the house of David, is made up of the tribes of Yehudah, which is often called Judah, Levi, which is called Levi, and also Benjamin, which is called Benjamin. And these tribes remained in the land during the time of the first century when Yahushua walked the earth. So therefore, when he was talking about looking for the lost sheep, we know therefore the context. We understand that he was looking for his brothers and sisters. He was preaching for his brothers and sisters to come home, to return to his people, to be reunited together. And therefore, that's what his message was about, the restoration. And so, in the time of the first century, when Yahushua is observing the Pesach, there's 100,000 people who live here, but there's 1 million people coming home. There's a huge number of people who had not heard about Yahushua at this time. And there's a lot of commotion that has taken place because when the people come home and they begin to make their ascent, is what they call it. When you go to Jerusalem, they say that you're going up, you're ascending, right? They call it aliyah. And when you're making the aliyah, you're making the pilgrimage back to Jerusalem, they begin to sing the famous song of the ascent. And the most famous passage, I mean, many people know, is I look to the hills where my help comes from. My help comes from YaHuWaH. And as they are singing this and they are going back to Jerusalem, we have Yahushua, Mashiach. He is coming to the city and he is riding upon a donkey. And at this exact moment in time, the Kohen Hagadol, which is the high priest, and all the Kohanim, which are the priests, the sons of Levi of Aharon, are gathered together in Bethlehem, which is Bethlehem, the house of bread, which is where Yahushua, our Messiah, was born, by the way, because the scriptures tell us in the book of Micah, which is Micah, in chapter 5, that the Mashiach is to come forth from Bethlehem, and his origins would be from ancient times, according to the context of that particular passage. And so the chief priests go and they select a perfect lamb from an ancient genealogy of sheep that have been brought forth by the patriarchs that were kept in Mitzrayim and brought out of the land of Mitzrayim into the promised land and had been kept for all these years for sacrifice for Yahuwah Elohim. And they went and picked a lamb that had ancient origins, a picture of Yahushua, from Bethlehem, where he was born, where the Messiah must come forth. And there they take the lamb, the high priest takes the lamb into the city. He comes in through the sheep gate. And there are people all over the place. We're talking about millions, again, over 1 million people that would come home. And they were very excited to participate in all these events because there was all types of singing and melodies and songs. There was an entire orchestra that would take place during this time period. Because many, many, many years previous, King David, who is the Melech of Yehudah and Yasharal, which Mashiach, the Messiah, has to come forth from, had orchestrated music. And he had also had the sons of Korah and Asaph and others to compose music. And these songs, we know them as the Psalms, which in Hebrew is the Tehillim. And the Tehillim are literally prophetic songs that were to be sung during the high festival days, during the Sabbaths, during the new moons, during the weddings, during the times of rejoicing. During all these times, Yahuwah Elohim had inspired David by the Ruach HaKodesh to write a symphony of music. And the entire Tanakh is a symphony of music. It is a melody from Bereshith all the way through into the prophets. There are songs and melodies for each and every verse and each and every stanza in the Hebrew scriptures because Yahuwah Elohim had inspired the scriptures by the Ruach HaKodesh. And so therefore, during this time period, there are many, many songs that are being sung. Again, the song of ascent, they're coming, they're singing the song of David. I look to the hills where my help comes from. My help comes from YaHuWaH. And there, as they are coming up the hills, there is Mashiach. And here he is going into Jerusalem. And he is riding on a donkey. Now, what is interesting is at the exact same moment, we have the Kohen Hagadol, the chief priest. And we know that Yahushua is a picture of the Kohen Hagadol. He is a priest forever, according to the order of the Melchizedek. And he is a Kohen in the Shamayim, in the heavens. And so here we have Yahushua, who is not only the priest, the Kohen Hagadol of Shamayim, but he's also the Lamb of YaHuWaH. And we also have the real physical man who was the high priest in that time from that genealogy. And he is bringing a real physical animal, a spotless lamb from Bethlehem, coming through the sheep gate. And at this exact moment when he would come through, the entire nation of Yasharal would burst forth into melody, to symphony, singing the Tehillim, the songs of David, specifically singing the Hallel prayers, the Hallel songs, which we know Hallel from the word hallelujah. That's where it comes from, because that is actually, that phrase appears many, many times in the Hallel prayers and the Hallel songs. And hallelujah means praise you, Yah. Praise you, Yah. So Yah is the short form of YaHuWaH. And of course, this is very important. We're going to see that this is what's going on exactly when we go into the scriptures. But I just want to set up what is going on so that everybody understands, because you are going to see things when we get to read these scriptures, and it's going to open your eyes and change your perspective of the Messiah forever, because you will get a glimpse into the true Lamb of YaHuWaH and what exactly was going on and why it is important that they were singing these songs and what these songs pointed to and what they meant. But first, let's go ahead and pick this up in YaHuCanon in John chapter 12, and we're going to start reading in verse 12. And it says, on the next day, a great crowd who had come to the festival, when they heard that Yahushua was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him. Now, this is what they also did for the high priest when he would come in with the sheep. We know this historically when we look at the historical references. So they did to him what they would do for the high priest. And it says they took palm branches and they went out to meet him and were crying out, Hosanna, Baruch haba b'shem Yahuwah. Now in your scriptures it might say Hosanna, but it says Hosanna in the Hebrew. And that's important. Baruch haba b'shem Yahuwah means Baruch, or people call this blessed, is he who is coming in the name of Yahuwah. Baruch haba b'shem Yahuwah. Because Yahushua, Mashiach, came in the name of his Father. His very name, Yahushua, means Yahuwah is deliverance. YaHuWaH, of course, is the name of the supreme I am that I am, the mighty one of Yaakov, of Yasharel. He is the one who exists, that he exists. YaHuWaH is his proper personal name. And Yahushua came in the name of YaHuWaH, and his students were singing this. They were singing the name. They were singing that he was coming in the name of YaHuWaH, and they were calling him the sovereign of Yasharel. Sovereign of Yasharel, of course, is referring to the son of David, the Melech, the king, the Mashiach, the anointed one who is to come forth from the loins of David through his generations, through his line. So this is what they're talking about. They acknowledge him as Mashiach here. And Yahushua, having found a young donkey, sat on it, as it has been written, do not fear, daughter of Sion. See, your sovereign is coming, sitting on the colt of a donkey. At first, his taught ones did not understand this. But when Yahushua was esteemed, then they remembered this, that was written, and that they had done this to him. Therefore, the crowd who were with him, when he called Eleazar, who is called Lazarus, out of the tomb, and raised him from the dead, were bearing witness. On account of this, the crowd also met him, because they heard that he had done this sign. The Pharisees then said amongst themselves, see, are you getting nowhere at all? The entire world has gone after him. And why had the entire world, the entire Yehudi world at the time, gone after him? Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. Again, there were people who were coming from all over the diaspora, all over the lands of their dispersion, of their exile, and they were coming home to Jerusalem. But there were many who are following him because the sign he had just done. He had just raised a man from the dead, a man by the name of Eleazar, who was called Lazarus, and people knew this man. He was a man of esteem. And so for this great sign to be done, the word of the testimony had reached the ears of these pilgrims and all these people who are coming home, and they are ready to meet this man, and they're forming lines, and they're singing songs, and they're rejoicing because they believe that the sovereign has come and he's going to overthrow the Romans. He's going to destroy them, and the Lion of the tribe of Yehudah is going to prevail and rule and reign from Mount Sion. But they did not fully understand that he had to be rejected, that he had to be given over into the hands of the Romans. They did not understand fully about the sufferings of Messiah that David prophetically spoke of in the Tehillim, and that he told us to sing in the Hallel songs. We're going to look at this in a moment. I've been speaking about it. I'm going to tie it all in together in just a moment. If you look at this, you won't fully grasp it without a historical context, the reality of what is really happening here. But with the historical context, it brings the scriptures to life. It brings the whole event to life, and you begin to see the Ruach and how the Ruach had orchestrated this entire event. Yahushua called it the time of their visitation. And when he came to Jerusalem, he wept over Jerusalem, because he said that if they had only known the time of their visitation, then all the things that the Romans were about to do to them would not happen, because he said that their enemies were going to build walls around them and destroy them, and sure enough, this is what happened. That is why there is no temple. That is why there is no house of YaHuWaH. But when the Bet HaMikdash was there, when the house of YaHuWaH was there in the first century, in Yahushua's lifetime, there was an obligation to go to the house of YaHuWaH. All the males had to appear before YaHuWaH and perform the Pesach and to observe this festival and this precept. They all had to be there, and Yahushua was no exception. He was coming into the land, and everyone was excited because it's the feast, and because they just see that this man had raised someone from the dead, so the Messiah is coming, and the time of the Romans is coming to an end, is what they thought. But Mashiach had to be betrayed by his brothers, just as Yahusuf, who was called Joseph in the Torah, was betrayed by his brothers and sold for silver into slavery. Yahushua was sold by his own student into prison, and there delivered into the hands of the nations. Just as Yahusuf was thrown into the pit, which is a picture of Sheol, and therefore when he came forth and he became esteemed, and he was seen as a king, a Pharaoh. He was seen as the right-hand man of Pharaoh, just as powerful as Pharaoh. Therefore, just like this, we see that Mashiach, he went into Sheol, he went into the pit, and he was esteemed, and he will be esteemed because he is the king, he is the Messiah, he is the Mashiach. All these analogies are throughout the scriptures. Very crucial to understand the Lamb of YaHuWaH, because in the very beginning, in Bereshith, we've already discussed this, that Cain and Abel, they brought forth offerings. Cain and Abel brought forth offerings to YaHuWaH, and YaHuWaH looked to Abel, who was called Abel's offering. And of course, Abel brought forth a lamb that was slaughtered to YaHuWaH. And then later, we see with the patriarch Abraham, Abraham is told to get up to Mount Moriah, which is Mount Moriah, and there he is to sacrifice his beloved firstborn son, Yitzhak, through his wife Sarah. And there he binds his son on Mount Moriah, and he goes to sacrifice his son. YaHuWaH stops him by the voice of the Malach YaHuWaH, the messenger of YaHuWaH. And there we see that there was a ransoming that took place, because off in the thicket, caught by a crown of thorns around his horns, was a ram to be sacrificed to YaHuWaH in the stead of Yitzhak. And then we see the Passover, of course, the great Passover. And on the night of the Passover, the firstborn was to be ransomed. The firstborn was to be ransomed by the price of a spotless male lamb in his first year. And here on the day of the Passover, Yahushua, who is the firstborn, the Bikor, who comes forth from YaHuWaH, who is the Ben YaHuWaH, he is offered up as a ransoming for an atonement. His Yahuwah Elohim said through the prophets that his righteous servant will make many righteous. And through his sufferings, their sins will be forgiven. Yahushua is the Lamb of YaHuWaH. It's really important to have a full context. Now, if we go to Luke chapter 19, verse 37, it says, and as he was coming near, already at the descent of the Mount of Olives, the entire crowd of the taught ones began to praise Elohim rejoicing with a loud voice for all the miracles they had seen, saying, Baruch haba b'shem YaHuWaH. Baruch is the sovereign who is coming in the name of YaHuWaH. Shalom in heaven, or the Shemayim, and esteem in the highest. And some of the Pharisees and the crowd said to him, Teacher, rebuke your taught ones. But he answering said to them, I say to you that if these should be silent, the stones themselves would cry out. Because this was the time of their visitation. This was the time when the Messiah was coming in. This was the time that he was to be announced and to be seen by all of his kinsmen and to be known. And they were esteeming him and they were praising him and they were excited about the reign of Yahuwah Elohim and how he had brought forth his sovereign. And they believed this. Thousands upon thousands of Yahudim believed in Yahushua. People don't seem to understand that. They think that Yahushua, his followers were all Gentiles or something. I don't know how they get this information, because again, he had thousands upon thousands of people who followed him all over the place, who he taught, who he fed the bread of life, who gave the words of life to. In Matithyahu 21 verse 9, it says, and the crowds who went before and those who followed cried out, saying, Hosanna, or again, your version may say Hosanna, Hosanna. Hosanna to the son of David, to the Ben David, which again is a code word for Messiah. Anytime it says the son of David, it's saying that because David was to have a son that would rule and reign forever. So, Hosanna to the son of David. Baruch haba b'shem YaHuWaH. Baruch is he who is coming in the name of YaHuWaH, Hosanna in the highest. And as he entered into Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, Who is this? And the crowd said, This is Yahushua, the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee. And Yahushua went into the set-apart place of Elohim and drove out all those buying and selling in the set-apart place, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, It has been written, My house shall be called a house of prayer, Bet Tefillah, but you have made it a den of robbers. And blind and lame ones came to him in the set-apart place, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonders which he did, and the children crying out in the Kodesh place, and saying, Hosanna to the Ben David, they were greatly displeased. They were greatly displeased. And I guess they were greatly displeased, because if you understand the time period, you understand that a lot of these priests were actually put in by the Romans. They did not rightfully deserve their heir to the Kohanim, some of them. And so it's really important, you got to kind of understand these things. These people were out to promote themselves, and they were doing so under a false pretense. And they wanted students, they wanted followers, they wanted to be called rabbi, they wanted to be called teacher. They liked these things. It was great. They had fun with it. It paid their bills. It gave them a place of esteem in the festivals, and they were able to rub shoulders with the important people. And now, all of a sudden, all of that is being challenged, because if the Roman Empire gets destroyed, guess what? These guys are no longer in positions of power. And so they have a problem. Because if the people believe this man is Mashiach, he has to be eliminated. And because if he's Mashiach, if he overthrows the Romans, if he happens to mess up the entire system that they have created, then he threatens their very existence. So this is why they were greatly displeased. Now, what Yahushua is doing here is actually very, very prophetic. Because if you understand the Passover, those of us who keep the Passover, you understand that there is a great deal of preparation. Not only during the time period when the temple stood, because you had to prepare, of course, by selecting the lamb on the 10th day of the month, and you had to keep that lamb for 4 days and sacrifice it on the 14th. But also because of the fact that there is leaven that must be removed from your home, which requires you to cleanse your home, to clean up your home. And historically, there is a tradition. Now, this is not in the Torah, but nonetheless, it is a tradition that is inspired, I believe, by the Ruach HaKodesh because of the fact of the symbolism that we see. And the tradition is that you involve the children. Now, that's not really a tradition. That's actually a Torah precept. You involve the children in all these things. But what they would do is to involve the children and take it to the next level, is that they basically cleanse the entire home. And then they will save a small portion of leaven, a small portion of chametz, of breadcrumbs, and they will hide it somewhere for a game for the children. Specifically for the sons. But if there are no sons, then the daughters, all the children can get involved. It's not really limited to just the son. But the point of the son is to pass down the knowledge. And so here they cleanse the home. And when they take this leaven out of the home, when they find it and it's discovered, they take the leaven out and they burn it. And here we see Yahushua comes in before the Passover into his father's house and to the house of YaHuWaH. And here he sees that there is contamination in the house, that they are making the house of YaHuWaH a den of robbers. And we know historically what was happening is they were selling these animals not even at market value, but way up beyond market value because of the fact that it's right there at the temple, the convenience of it. It's almost like, for those of you who go see movies or something like that, it's almost like buying popcorn in the theater, except it's way more dramatic than that. There's a huge markup because you're there and, these events are going on. And so if you buy it here, it's going to cost more. And not only that, but they're not even supposed to be buying and selling in the house of YaHuWaH at all. At all. But just so you understand, this is the kind of stuff that was going on. There was a lot of corruption because the Romans were running the show, basically. And so people who were doing this for the Romans. I mean, sure, they were doing it for their own benefit. But believe me, there was a lot of corruption coming from the Romans due to these things that were going on in the first century. And so Yahushua comes to his father's house and he sees the maliceness, the wickedness. He sees the corruption, the metaphoric leaven, so to speak. And then he drives that leaven out of his father's house. And we know historically that he did not burn them with fire. But we know that in the future, however, those who will be driven out of his father's house will be burned. Just like when the leaven is purged from the home, it is burned outside the house. And so you don't want to be corrupt. You don't want to be greedy for gain. You don't want to pervert righteous judgment. The Torah teaches to keep righteous judgment. It's all throughout the Torah. And so Yahushua was cleansing his father's house. This is not all just happen chance. He's doing these things at the specific time for a reason. Now, let's get to some of the key points of what was said in all of these accounts, because we looked at all the various accounts and we saw that each and every time we saw keywords like Hosanna, which again, if you're reading King James, is Hosanna. Hosanna comes from the Hallel prayers that I've already mentioned, the Tehillim or Psalms chapter 113 through 118. But I want to look specifically at 118. We're not going to look at the whole chapter, but I would love for you to go and do that in your spare time. But for right now, we're just going to look at the key points of the various verses in this song. In Psalm 118, verse 14, Yah is my strength and song, and he has become my deliverance. In the Hebrew and the Abrit, it's Azi, Wazimrat YaHuWaH le Yahshua. Azi means my strength. Wazimrat means and song. Yah is the short poetic form of YaHuWaH, which we hear in the phrase Hallelujah, which is where we get the name of this particular song, the Hallel, because of Hallelujah. So it says, Azi Wazimrat, my strength and song is Yah. YaHuWaH, and he is becoming li, mine. Li le Yahshua, mine unto deliverance. Le Yahshua is deliverance or redemption. And it is where Yahushua gets his name from. Yahushua literally is YaHuWaH is my deliverance. YaHuWaH is deliverance. He delivers. He redeems. He saves. All these things. So here we see that the songs that were being sung at the exact moment that Mashiach was coming down the descent of the Mount of Olives, and as the Kohen Hagadol, the high priest, was bringing in the sacrificial Passover lamb for the priesthood, that the songs were being sung, and this song is telling us that Yah is my Yahshua, which is where Yahushua's name comes from in the first place. And then if we go to verse 15, it says, the voice of rejoicing and deliverance is in the tents of the righteous. The right hand of YaHuWaH is doing mightily. In Hebrew, it's kol rina, YaHuWaH, beholi, zadakim yamin, Yahuwah asa, kayil. Kol means the voice, rina of rejoicing, YaHuWaH, and redemption. So the voice of rejoicing and Yahshua. Beholi, in the tabernacle, Zadakim, of the righteous. Yamin, the right hand, Yahuwah, Osa. Yahuwah does, Kayil, valiantly. So here we see literally two concepts that are brought together in one beautiful passage. We see the concept of Yahuwah's deliverance, his Yahshua, yet again, which is heard in the tabernacle of the righteous. And then we see this idea of Yahshua is tied in directly with Yamin Yahuwah. Yamin Yahuwah, which is the right hand of Yahuwah. If we go and read the Tehillim of David, of Dawid, Tehillim or Psalm chapter 110, we see that the text says, Yahuwah said to my master, come and sit at my right hand, come sit at my yamin, until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And so further in this passage, it says that you are a Kohen, a priest, after the order of Melchizedek forever. And we're going to talk about Melchizedek a little bit later. But Melchizedek is the man who brought forth bread and wine before YaHuWaH and before Abraham. And he barak Abraham and said, Baruch be Abraham of the Most High Elohim. And so this is all a foreshadowing. Yahushua would also be a Kohen after this order of the ancient order of Melchizedek. So all this is important to understand because here it's calling it the right hand of Yahuwah. And further in verse 16, it says the right hand of Yahuwah is exalted. The right hand of Yahuwah acts mightily. Let me not die, but live and declare the works of Yah. Yah has punished me severely, but did not give me over to death. Open to me the gates of righteousness. I enter through them. I thank Yah. I give Todah to Yah. This is the gate of Yahuwah. The righteous enter through it. I give Todah or thanks to Yahuwah, for you have answered me and have become my deliverance. And we know that Yahushua, when he came into Jerusalem, he had to come through the gates of Jerusalem. And as he's coming through the gates of Jerusalem, they are singing about the deliverance of Yahuwah and about the gate of Yahuwah and coming through the gate of Yahuwah. And further, if we look at the Hebrew, it says, Oka ki anitani watahi li le Yahshua. Oka means I will praise. Ki, for anitani, you hear me. Watahi, and are becoming, li, which is mine, le Yahshua, unto deliverance, unto Yahshua. Again, coming from the root of Yahushua's name, Yahshua. Again, here we are seeing the idea of Yahushua being the deliverance of Yahuwah embedded in the Tehillim, which was given by inspiration of the Ruach HaKodesh to the writers of the Hallel prayers, so that therefore it would be sung at this moment of visitation, this great orchestra, this great song that is happening. If we go on to verse 22, it says, the stone which the builders have rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This was from Yahuwah, It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day YaHuWaH has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. I pray, O YaHuWaH, please save. I pray, O YaHuWaH, please send prosperity. In Hebrew, in a Brit, it's Ana, YaHuWaH, Hoshi, Ana. Ana means I beseech YaHuWaH, or I call out to YaHuWaH. Hoshia, which is please save, na, now. Please save now. Hoshiana, Hoshiana, Hoshiana. This is why they're saying Hoshiana. See, clearly, if you look at the context of everything that is happening, you can clearly see when they tried to transliterate the word Hoshiana, which is actually two words put together. They thought it was one word and they tried to transliterate it and they called it Hosanna. That here clearly it's because of this passage, because this is what was sung in the times of the first century when the temple was still standing and the sacrifice of the Passover was brought in through the gate of the righteous. And they were singing about how the chief cornerstone would be betrayed and how the salvation or the Yahshua of YaHuWaH is a picture of his right hand, and how the YaHuWaH would not give him over to death, but he would give him life. And all these things are all embedded prophetically. And this is what they were singing. If only they all understood the full implications. And there were many who did. But if only the entire nation could have seen the implications of why they were doing what they were doing at that exact moment in time. And then it says in verse 26, it says, Baruch, or blessed is he who's coming in the name of YaHuWaH. We shall barak you from the house of YaHuWaH. Now again, of course, this is Baruch haba b'shem YaHuWaH, which means blessed, or Baruch is he who is coming in the name of YaHuWaH. And Yahushua said literally to those who were accusing him before his death that they would not see him again until they were able to say Baruch haba b'shem YaHuWaH. Baruch is he who is coming in the name of YaHuWaH. And we know that since this time period, the name of YaHuWaH has been banned off the lips of the Yahudim. Only it is pronounced sometimes in Yerushalayim, but outside in the diaspora, in the exile, they will not pronounce it because of fear for that it would be profaned by the nations. And so Yahushua is telling us here that we must be able to say, Baruch is he who is coming in the name of YaHuWaH. Again, he came in his Father's name. Yahushua means Yahuwah delivers, Yahuwah redeems, Yahuwah is the Yahshua, Yahushua. And he came in his Father's name. He did all of his works in his Father's name. All the signs and wonders that he did in his Father's name. In verse 27 of the same prayer in Psalm 118, it says, Yahuwah is El, and he gave us light. Bind the festival offering with cords to the horns of the slaughter place, of the altar. You are my El, and I praise you. You are my Elohim, and I exalt you. Give Todah to Yahuwah, for he is Tov, for his kindness is everlasting. Ki leolam chesto, which means his kindness and compassion is everlasting and forever. Yahuwah here has given us a clear picture. He says that Yahuwah has gave us light. And then after it mentions the light, it tells us to bind the festival offering to the horns of the altar. So something that is not picked up in all of the examples of Yahushua's death, they could not write down the entire Psalm 113 through 118 and talk about all the importance. They were trying to give you all the relevance. So they gave you that it said Hoshiana, and it gave you that it said Baruch haba b'shem YaHuWaH. But what more was being said is also bind the festival offering to the horns of the altar. This is being sung, of course, because there is a lamb that is being brought into the gate of the righteous that it's talking about in Psalm 118. But also because Yahushua HaMashiach is coming in at the exact same moment in time. And it's referring to him, saying, bind him. He is the light. Yahuwah gave us light. Now bind the slaughter offering to the horns of the altar, because he is our Passover. He's a picture of the Pesach. He's the entire purpose behind the ransoming of the firstborn. This has been completely lost in time, and Western understanding of the Scriptures, there is no knowledge of this whatsoever. But if you understand these events and these songs that were being sung, again, it not only brings the text to life, but it shows you the fact that it is all inspired by the Ruach HaKodesh. Because when you go back into the Scriptures to see where it says Hoshiana, where it says Baruch haba b'shem Yahuwah, you see all of this information about Yahshua being the deliverance and the song of Yahuwah, and how he is the redemption of Yahuwah, and that Yahshua, the Yahshua of Yahuwah, again, is a picture of Yahushua in the Hebrew text. There's no way to really miss it when you go back into the Hebrew and you really look and you see that not only does it correlate him to the right hand of Yahuwah, but it correlates him to the chief cornerstone who has to be rejected by the builders. The builders have to reject him and bind him to the altar as a picture of the festival offering. This is all here in the Scriptures, and it's so amazing, so beautiful, so rich in the text. If you go further into Matithyahu, into Matthew now, and we go to 26 verse 2, it says, you know that after 2 days, the Passover has to take place. And the Ben Adam is to be delivered up and to be impaled, to be delivered and to be nailed to the stake. Some have said crucified. But nonetheless, Yahushua here, by his own admission, is saying that in 2 days from the time that he's speaking, then the Passover takes place. And on the day that the Passover is to be sacrificed, so the son of Adam, the Ben Adam, must also be given to the hands of the chief priests and to the council, and to be given over to the Romans and be betrayed and be put to death on the day of the Passover by his own admission. Now, briefly, I want to address a little bit of confusion that has risen in the text because of reading the text strictly in the English. In the English, you miss so much, and it can cause a little bit of confusion because there are those who believe that Yahushua did not actually die on the day of the Passover, but rather observed the Passover the night before. They called it his Last Supper. That's what it's been, called by most. And this is predominantly because of a few passages, and I'm going to read those passages. In Matithyahu 26 verse 17, for instance, it says, "And on the first day of unleavened bread, the taught ones came to Yahushua, saying to him, 'Where do you wish for us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?' And then in Mark chapter 14, verse 12, it says, 'And on the first day of unleavened bread, when they were slaughtering the Passover lamb, his taught ones said to him, Where do you wish for us to go prepare for you to eat the Passover?'" Now remember that in both of these texts, Matthew, Mark, and also in Luke and Yochanan, you see clearly that Yahushua died on the preparation day of the Passover, which is the 14th of Abib, no doubt. But here it almost makes it seem like in both of these texts that perhaps it wasn't. Maybe the lambs were being sacrificed and they needed to go ahead and eat the Passover, and maybe the next day wasn't Passover somehow. You'd have to throw out a lot of verses to make that happen. But if you actually go back into the Greek and in the Aramaic, it clears up the entire problem. Because, for instance, in the Aramaic, the word for first there, where it says the first day of unleavened bread. Now, if you read it, let me just first read it again, just so you catch a few things. It says in Matithyahu 26:17, "And on the first day of unleavened bread, the taught ones came to Yahushua, saying to him, 'Where do you wish for us to eat, to go to prepare to eat the Passover?'" Well, just think about this for a moment. We've already studied in the Torah about the Pesach and how it's to be observed. And we know that the Passover is eaten in the night. It is eaten on the 15th day, because the day begins in the evening. It is eaten that night it is the beginning of unleavened bread. So the first thing you do on unleavened bread is eat the Passover. It's the first thing you do, and you do it in the evening. And so it would be impossible to say the first day of unleavened bread had come when the Passover needed to be sacrificed. Because when you read in the Torah, the Passover is sacrificed the day before the first day of unleavened bread. So automatically something should tell you that there's a problem in the text. And it can be cleared up With the Aramaic, the word for first is kadmaya. And kadmaya literally means before. And in Greek, you have the word protos, which can mean both before and first, which would make this a little confusing. But if you plug in the right interpretation to the text, it no longer says that it was the first day of unleavened bread when the Passover needed to be sacrificed, which makes no sense. But if we plug in the proper interpretation of before, it will read this way. And before the day of unleavened bread, the taught ones came to Yahushua saying, where do you wish for us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? Now that makes sense because after all, the day before unleavened bread, the Passover has to be sacrificed. But it doesn't say it's the day before, it just says, and before the day. So, obviously it was not just the day before, it was the day before the sacrifice was done. But anyway, here it makes a lot more sense when we go back and look at the words kadmaya, which is Aramaic, and protos, which is Greek, which both can mean before. In the book of Mark 14:12 that I already read, it said on the first day of unleavened bread again. But if you make it, if you put in the actual interpretation, it says, and before the day of unleavened bread, when they were slaughtering the Passover lamb. And that makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. If you said on the first day of unleavened bread when they're sacrificing the Passover lamb, it doesn't make any sense because they don't sacrifice the lamb on the first day of unleavened bread. They sacrifice it the day before. So if you plug in the proper meaning, once again, it would be, and before the day of unleavened bread when they were slaughtering the Passover lamb, then that brings about complete harmony with the rest of all the scriptures we've already looked at that tell us that it was indeed the day of the Passover when Yahushua died, and that he did not eat Passover the night before. And we can prove that further. If we go to Luke chapter 22 and verse 1, it says, and the festival of unleavened bread drew near, which is called Passover, and the chief priests and scribes were seeking how to kill him, for they feared the people. And Shaitan entered into Yehuda, who is called the man from Kerioth or Ishkarioth or Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. And he went and spoke with the chief priests and captains how he would deliver him up. And they were glad and agreed to give him silver. And he promised and was seeking an occasion to deliver him up to them away from the crowd. And the day of unleavened bread came when the Passover had to be slaughtered. Again, we know that it can't be the day of unleavened bread when the Passover had to be slaughtered, so we know there's a problem. And literally, again, we're talking about that it was coming. If you look at it in the Aramaic and in the Greek, it doesn't mean that it came, it means the day was coming. The day was coming when the Passover had to be slaughtered. It doesn't mean it was that day. And he sent Kepha and Yochanan, saying, go and prepare the Passover for us to eat. And they said to him, where do you wish for us to prepare? And he said to them, see, as you enter into the city, a man shall meet you carrying a jar of water. Follow him into the house he enters. And you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I might eat the Pesach, the Passover, with my taught ones? And he shall show you a large furnished upper room, prepare it there. And going, they found it as he had said to them, and they prepared the Pesach. They prepared the Passover. Now, of course, they didn't prepare the Passover lamb because, first of all, that is not for just anybody to do. You go to the house of YaHuWaH, and that is where the Passover lamb is sacrificed, and that's where you will get your lamb, and you will roast it, and you will go home and eat it. However, here, it doesn't mention anything about lamb. It just says they're preparing for Passover. And should we be surprised that Yahushua is preparing for Passover a day before the lamb is to be sacrificed? Not at all, because again, preparation for Passover begins well in advance before the Passover, at least by the 10th when the lamb is selected for the home. But we know that most people would start cleansing their home and cleaning their home of crumbs and things like that even before that, because you can get all kinds of stuff in your cupboards and in your various storage places which you're not even aware of. So people start cleansing and cleaning even in advance from that. So the idea of preparing for Passover shouldn't be that foreign. But the reason people get confused is because he says, well, I'm going to eat the Passover here, and they're going to prepare the Passover. But it does not say that they ate the Passover anywhere in the scriptures. It just says that he's preparing to eat the Passover. So if we actually look in Luke chapter 2, verse 41, we get a glimpse as why Yahushua would be preparing. Because it says, and his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the festival of the Passover. So every single year, his parents had gone to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. Yahushua had always done this. He had always kept the Passover his whole life. So this time, yes, he's preparing. He's preparing because his students are still going to eat the Passover. But they're going to eat the Passover after he dies. Because Yahushua dies at the time the Passover was sacrificed. And so that night, because it was a chief yom of the Sabbath, Rabba Yom do Shabbat, or Shabbat Hagadol, a high Shabbat, because it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the Passover, the first day is when the Passover is eaten in the evening or at night, rather. And because of this, they would be eating the Passover lamb that night, the night after his suffering. And so, how do we know this further? Well, we can look at some more examples. In Matithyahu, chapter 26, verse 26. And it says, and they were eating. As they were eating, Yahushua took bread. And having Baruch, he broke and gave it to his taught ones. And he said, take, eat, this is my body. Now pause there for a moment. In Hebrew, the word for bread, when it is talking about unleavened bread, is matzah. When we're talking about just bread in general, it can be the word lechem. In Aramaic, when we're talking about the word for unleavened bread, it's patire. But when we're talking about the word for just regular bread, it's lakma. And in Greek, the word for a regular bread is artos. But for unleavened bread, it's azuma. But here in 100% of the testimonies, whether you look at the Aramaic, the Hebrew, or the Greek for Matthew, for Matithyahu, is always unanimously in all the languages the word for bread in general, not the word matzah or patire. Neither one of those words appear, but rather you see in the Hebrew Matthew, you just say, it says lechem. He passed bread, lechem. In Aramaic, it says lachma. So, in the Greek, again, it's not the word for unleavened bread. It's the word for just regular bread. So the entirety of the revelation. And then if you go and look at the sources in Aramaic and Greek for Luke and Mark and YaHuWaH, which is John, you see never once is matzah mentioned. The word matzah never appears. And further, we can prove this because of the fact that Yahushua HaMashiach, he washed the feet of his students. That, by definition, is servile labor, servile work, in which he would not have washed the feet of his students on a day where no servile work is to be done. And if you don't believe that, you can look even further and look at the example in YaHuWaH, which is John chapter 13, verse 26. It says, Yahushua answered, it is he to whom I give a piece of bread, which again is the word lachma in Aramaic there, when I have dipped it. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Yehuda from Kerioth, son of Shimon. And after the piece of bread, Shatan entered into him. Yahushua therefore said to him, what you do, do quickly. But no one at the table knew why he said this to him. For some were supposing because Yehuda had the bag. This is talking about the fact that he was the treasurer. He had the money bag. That Yahushua was saying to him, they thought because he had the money bag, that Yahushua was saying to him, buy what we need for the festival, or that we should give somewhat to the poor. Now, this is a dead giveaway. YaHuWaH, John, is called the beloved Talmid, the beloved student of Yahushua. It is he who reclined upon Yahushua's chest during the eating of his final meal. If anybody knows what happened at that last meal, it's YaHuWaH. It is his testimony that should be examined in great detail because, again, he was there. Mark and Lucas were not there. Matithyahu was there, and his example should be looked at as well. And all the examples should be looked at. I'm not saying that one is superior to the other. I'm just saying that we have to understand YaHuWaH is a first eyewitness. He was there, he experienced it, and this is what he thought happened. This is what they all thought happened. When Yahushua told Judas Iscariot, who's called Yehuda Ishkariot, when he told him, what you do, go do quickly, they thought that he was telling him to go buy something for the festival. Now you have to understand, if this is the Passover, if they're eating the Passover, it is now the first day of unleavened bread, and it is unlawful. It is a sin. It is a breaking of the Torah, and one of the utmost crimes to actually break one of the high festivals by buying and selling. So why on earth would the students of Yahushua, who again, Yahushua is a rabbi, why on earth would they think that their master is instructing one of his students to break the high Sabbath, the Shabbat Haggadah? I mean, if this was the Passover meal, that's what he would be doing. It can't be the Passover because they thought he was going out and buying and selling. Now notice, now people might say, well, it's Judas Iscariot, and I mean, who says he won't buy or sell on a high Sabbath, right? Well, that's not actually what the argument is. The argument is that they think Yahushua is telling him to buy and sell on the Sabbath. I mean, come on, Yahushua would never tell one of his students to break the Sabbath. And if they knew it was the high Shabbat of Matzah, the Chag, the festival, they would never have thought that Yahushua was telling anybody to buy or sell. That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. The Last Supper of Yahushua was not the Passover. It was not the Passover. It is clearly, if we go back to Matityahu chapter 26, verse 26, again it said, Yahushua took bread, and having Baruch, he broke and gave it to his taught ones, and said, take, eat, this is my body. And taking the cup and giving Todah, or thanks, he gave it to them and saying, drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood, that of the Brit Chadasha, the renewed covenant, which is shed for many for the forgiveness of sins. But I say to you, I shall certainly not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day that I drink it with you anew in the Malkut, in the reign, the kingdom of my Father. And having sung a song, now King James, it says that they're singing a hymn. I mean, many people, they probably don't even know what that means, because they think of a hymn, they think of Christian hymns, Amazing Grace, things like that. That's not what it's talking about. A hymn or a song, whenever they sing a song, they are singing the songs that are written in the book of Psalms, in the Tehillim. And so that's what's going on here. But there's more that's going on. It says that they went out to the Mount of Olives. Now, the reason that all this is important is because Yahushua is breaking bread and he is bringing forth wine, and he is saying that this is somehow a picture of the Brit Chadasha through his blood. And the only way to understand the significance of the bread and the wine and what he is doing is to understand the Torah. Because in the Torah, in Genesis chapter 14, it says, and Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, or my king of righteousness is literally what Melchizedek means, sovereign of Shalom, or Melech of Shalom, brought out bread and wine. And he was the priest of the Most High El. And he Baruch him and said, Baruch be Abram, of the Most High El, possessor of the heavens and the earth. Now the reason this is important is because Melchizedek, we don't get any information about Melchizedek in the Torah. There are historical informations about Mount Melchizedek that you can look at in commentaries and various things, but you will not see in the Torah any mention of genealogy. He just comes out of nowhere almost, as it seems, and all of a sudden it is him that he's a Kohen of the Most High Elohim, and he comes before Abram and he brings forth bread and wine. And here he is a picture of the Mashiach, of the Messiah. Because in Psalm 110, like I've already said, it says, YaHuWaH said to my master, this is David who's speaking, he's calling the Mashiach his master, come and sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And then it goes on to say, I have made you a Kohen, a priest, after the order of Melchizedek forever. So this is all important. Now, because of the confusion, again, just going back to touch on a little bit about the confusion of Yahushua's last meal. Because of some of this confusion, people have got the timing off. But this can all be fixed because, again, look at all the testimonies. They all say on the preparation day was the day of his death. But the thing that stands out, that just really, really has to be observed here, is that not only is this not the Passover, but it is something that has to do with Passover. Because in the first century, rabbis, when they had their students, they would take their students the night before festivals and they would rehearse most of the songs and also the prayers and many of the things that were attributed to the next day festival. And many people are familiar with this because, for instance, in modern times, when a feast is coming, one of the feasts, people might go on the internet or they might look for a video, they might look for a specific teaching that has to relate to that festival to bring them into the mood and to refresh their understanding and revive it. So what Yahushua is doing is a picture of the Passover, but it's not the day of the Passover. Because during the Passover, there is matzah, which again, the Hebrew word for matzah never appears when he breaks the bread, but there is matzah and there is wine, there is yain. And yain or wine is used, there's four cups. And here we see that Yahushua goes through many of the cups, and through one of the cups he will not observe. Now, the answer to all this is in the Psalms. And the key here is the fact that it said they sung a hymn. And here we get more insight. But I just wanted to bring that part up about the first century because many people, they get confused because they see the bread, they see the wine, but notice he says the bread is a picture of his body, the wine is a picture of his blood. Now, if he had some lamb, surely the lamb is obvious, right? It would have seemed that he would have made some type of proclamation to him being the Lamb of YaHuWaH if there had been lamb indeed there, but not a mention of lamb at all at this meal. Again, because it's not. But it is a rehearsal. It is a preparation. He's teaching his students. After all, it's the night before the Passover is going to be sacrificed. It's the night before it's sacrificed. And then again, that same day in the evening, going into the night, on the 15th is when it's eaten. So it's literally a day away from the consuming of the Passover at this particular time. So it makes perfect sense that they're going through and we're rehearsing and he's teaching and showing them, instructing them about what they are to do when they observe the Passover, because the next night, see here he's the master teacher, the rabbi is teaching them about the observance of Passover. But the next night, they're going to observe the Passover without him. And they are going to watch him be sacrificed. We'll watch him die. And then they are going to go home and eat the Passover meal. And they are going to realize the sufferings of Messiah. They are going to see and experience, they're going to understand. That's why Shaul knew. He said that Mashiach, Messiah, our Passover was sacrificed for us. Yahushua himself said, after 2 days will be the Passover, and the Son of Man must be delivered. So again, on the Passover, he did not eat Passover that night. You have to understand this in order to fully understand the revelation of the Bashar, of the glad tidings. He was preparing his students. Also, you have to understand that the bread and wine is also symbolic of the Shabbat. It is done on the Sabbath. The barakah, or the quote-unquote blessings, not really a blessing, it's more of a gift offering of praise to Yahuwah Elohim, is said over the bread and the wine. And this is also to be done for as a picture and for Mashiach, also as a reminder of his role as a Kohen forever after the order of Melchizedek. However, this was also specifically related to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So all this is pictured, is a picture. The Last Supper, as many call it, is a picture of not only the Passover, but a picture of the weekly Sabbath. Anytime where the bread and the wine were to be observed, this was to be done as a remembrance. Yahushua said, do this in a remembrance for me. So this why. Now, if we go back and we look at this song, what was this song that they sung after the meal? And how could we know? Well, we know because historically, again, the Hallel songs are focused upon and meditated on and sung throughout the entirety of this particular festival. If we go and look at Psalm 116, which begins the prayers and the songs, and we look at verse 13, it says, I lift up the cup of deliverance and call upon the name of YaHuWaH. One of the most powerful proclamations in the prayers is this very verse. In Hebrew, it's kos Yeshuaot, Esa Wabashem, Yahuwah Akara. Kos means cup. Yeshuaot is the plural form of Yahshua. So the cup of Yahshua, the kos Yeshuaot, the cup of redemption. Esa, I take. Wabashem, and in the name Yahuwah Akara, I call or I proclaim. So literally it says he's taking up the cup of Yahshua, of the redemptions. And on the name of YaHuWaH I call. Yahushua had just passed the cup of Yahshuaot, the kos Yahshuaot, the cup of redemption, the cup of deliverance. And they made this proclamation after they drunk from the wine. They sung this song. And we know this historically. This is what they were doing. There's just no doubt at all, because of the fact that this is how the Hagim, how the festivals were observed in the time of the first century. And there's many, many, many historical witnesses that verify this fact. So we see Yahushua's name is embedded in the Hallel, in the Hallelujah songs, in the Tehillim, Psalm 116 through 118, embedded through there all throughout the entire Revelation. And here, specifically, David talks about taking up the cup of Yahshua and calling on the name of YaHuWaH, which is what we are to do. Profess YaHuWaH and to walk in the deeds of Mashiach and to profess his life, death, and resurrection. In verse 14, the very next verse, it says, I pay my vows to YaHuWaH, now in the presence of all his kind ones. Precious in the eyes of YaHuWaH is the death of his kind ones. So here, after they take the cup and they sing this song about taking the cup of redemption, the cup of Yahshuaot, and calling on the name of YaHuWaH, it then goes into the revelation of the death of Yahuwah's kind ones, because Yahushua HaMashiach has just prophesied that this cup is a picture of his blood. The kos Yeshuaot, the cup of redemption, the cup of deliverance, is a picture of his blood, the blood of the Brit Chadasha, the renewed covenant. And then it says here clearly that it is a picture of his death, because it says, I pay my vows to YaHuWaH, now in the presence of all his people. Precious in the eyes of YaHuWaH is the death of his kind ones. Now, if we go to Yahuwah in John chapter 19, verse 4, it says, Pilate went outside again and said to them, see, I am bringing him out to you, to let you know that I find no guilt in him. Now, Pilate is not the high priest. It's not the Kohen HaGadol. But this is the proclamation that is made before the Passover lamb is sacrificed by the Kohen HaGadol. When the Kohen, the high priest, has inspected the lamb for 4 days, on the 14th day of Abib, before he is killed, there's a proclamation made to the entire nation that the lamb has been inspected and I find no guilt in him. And here Pilate foreshadows this by declaring to the people he had found no guilt in Yahushua. Then Yahushua came outside wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, see the man. So when the chief priests and officers saw him, they shouted, away, impale him, impale. Pilate said to them, you take him and impale him, for I find no guilt in him. In verse 14 of the same chapter, and it was the preparation day of the Passover week, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Yahudim, see your sovereign. But they shouted, away, away, impale him. Pilate said to them, shall I impale or crucify or nail to the stake your sovereign? The chief priests answered, we have no sovereign except for Kaiser, the Caesar. At that time then he delivered him to them to be nailed to the stake or impaled. And they took Yahushua and led him away, and bearing his stake,
he went out to the so-called place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, where they impaled him and the two others with him, one on this side and one on that side, and Yahushua in the middle. And Pilate wrote a title too, and he put it on the stake, and it was written, Yahushua ha-Nazari, or of Nazareth, the sovereign of the Yahudim. Many of the Yahudim therefore read this title, for the place where Yahushua was impaled was near the city. And it was written in Hebrew, in Greek, and in Roman. Now remember, there's over 1 million pilgrims, and many of these people have just seen Yahushua raise Lazarus from the dead. They had no idea he was about to be killed because Yahushua was caught in the night like a thief, and they brought him in and gave him a false jury, basically, and accused him to death without the people at large knowing what was going on. Only about 300 people, 400, maybe 500 people could fit around in the square where Yahushua was being brought out by Pilate. So the people who got there first were the people who already knew he was going to be nailed to the stake. And there they surrounded and they cried out that they had no king except for a Caesar, because they were so corrupted and they had been put in those positions by Rome. And so therefore, they wanted to deliver Yahushua up to the Romans to be killed on the preparation day of the Passover. And Pilate acknowledges that he was the sovereign of the Yahudim because he has a sign made for Yahushua that read this way: Yahushua ha-Nazareth YaHuWaH ha-Yahudim. Now, if you know anything about the Yahudim, you know that the Yahudim, who have been called Jews, they enjoy acronyms. In fact, the Tanakh, the word Tanakh, is an acronym of the words Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketubim, which means Torah, prophets, and writings. They take the first letter of each of the words and they make a new word. What's interesting is Yahushua's sign over his head, Yahushua ha-Nazari, Melech ha-Yahudim, which means Yahushua of Nazareth and the king of the Yahudim. If you take each letter at the beginning, you have Yod, Hey, Wah, Hey. This is really important because the Passover Lamb, when it was brought to the Temple Mount, which is at Mount Moriah, which Golgotha is actually on Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is actually a huge mountain that has been excavated and cut out many times over history, but this is in the same region. And Yahushua, of course, wasn't nailed to the stake on the temple, in the temple or anything like that, but it was on the mountain where the temple is. And there he was brought, and there above him there's the sign. But when a lamb is brought to the temple, to the high priest, because there were so many people, we're talking about, like, again, over 1 million people who were celebrating the Passover, to keep up with the lambs, they would put a sign around the neck of the lamb that would have the family name of whoever the lamb belonged to. And above Yahushua's head, we have the sign, the family name, the name of his father, the name of his Abba, which is YaHuWaH. So there's a reason why they wanted the name taken down. The sign, not only did it say that he was the king of the Yahudim, but the acronym spelled out YaHuWaH, Yod He Wah He, the Father's name. So there's a lot of information there as well. Now, Mark chapter 15, verse 5 says, and it was the 3rd hour, and they impaled him, or they nailed him to the stake. And the inscription of his accusation was written above, the sovereign of the Yahudim. And with him they impaled 2 robbers, one on his right and the other on his left. And the scripture was filled, which says, as he was reckoned with the lawless. And those passing by were blaspheming him, shaking their heads and saying, ah, you who destroy the dwelling place and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the stake. And likewise the chief priests and scribes, mocking to one another, said, he saved others. He is unable to save himself. The Messiah, the sovereign of Yisrael, come down from the stake so that we see and believe. And those who were impaled with him were reproaching him. And when the 6th hour came, darkness came over all the land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Yahushua cried out with a loud voice, saying, Ali, Ali, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my El, why have you forsaken me? And some of those standing by, when they heard it, said, "See, he is calling for Eliyahu." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a reed and offered for him to drink, saying, "Leave him and let us see if Eliyahu does come to take him down." Because there was an expectation for Eliyahu, who's been called Elijah, to return according to the book of Malachi. So when Yahushua said, "Ali, Ali," they thought that that was the short, him basically trying to say Eliyahu, Eliyahu. So they thought that Eliyahu maybe Eliyahu's going to come, which kind of shows you that these people were taunting Yahushua, hoping that he was going to come down from the stake and prove himself. But instead, he allowed himself to be murdered publicly. And he was like a lamb brought to the slaughter. He did not oppose the accusations against him. He did not fight. He could have fought back, but he didn't fight back. Instead, he allowed himself to be nailed to the stake and publicly humiliated. And we see that it was the third hour. The book of Mark tells us in Hebrew time that it was the third hour of the day. This is important. Oftentimes in the Brit Chadasha, you will see the third hour, the sixth hour, and the ninth hour mentioned. This is because at the third hour of the day, which is roughly 9 o'clock on Roman time, the first slaughter offering would take place. Every day there's a slaughter offering for YaHuWaH. It's not just on the feast days, but every single day. It's called the Korban Tamid, the perpetual standing slaughter offering. It must be performed in the morning and must be performed in the evening. At the ninth hour is when the final sacrifice is slain. At the third hour, again, is when the morning sacrifice. So at 9 a.m. on Roman time, the first morning slaughter offering takes place. So Yahushua is nailed to the stake at the moment the first lamb of the day is slaughtered. And then it says that darkness covers the land at the sixth hour until the ninth hour. At the sixth hour is the moment in time when the evening slaughter offering is selected. And at the ninth hour, the hour that he died, the evening slaughter offering is performed. This is about 3 o'clock. So at 9 a.m., he was nailed to the stake. At about 12 p.m., which is noontime, this is when darkness covered the land. And at the ninth hour, which is 3 p.m. on Roman time, is the time when Yahushua gave up his Ruach. And this is the time when the Passover Lamb was slaughtered at Bein Ha'arabim, between the evenings at 3 p.m. So we know the exact time that Yahushua died. We know the exact day that he died. There is nothing hindering us from observing the time of his death and knowing it, because it is the time of the Passover. And so, we have to familiarize ourselves with this information. Another thing that was said by Yahushua and is transliterated, an attempt to transliterate, is the Hebrew expression Ali Ali Lama Sabachthani. Now, people have said that is Aramaic. That is not Aramaic, it's actually Hebrew. It comes from Tehillim, or Psalms, chapter 22. And again, see how the book of Psalms just plays such a huge part of this teaching, because it is such a prophetic writing. In Tehillim, Psalm chapter 22, verse 1, the very first line of this famous song of David that all of the people of the time would have known is Ali Ali Lama Sabachthani, or my El, why have you forsaken me? Further, it says, far from saving me, far from the words of my groaning. O my Elohim, I call by day, but you do not answer, and by night I find no rest. Yet you are Kodesh, you are set apart, enthroned on the praises of Yasharel. Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted and you delivered them. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you and were not ashamed. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men, despised by the people. All those who see me mock me. They shoot out the lip. They shake the head, saying, he trusted in YaHuWaH. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, seeing that he is delighted in him. For you are the one who took me out of the womb, causing me to trust while on my mother's breast. I was cast upon you from birth. From my mother's belly you have been my El. Do not be far from me, for distress is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong ones of Bashan have encircled around me. They have opened their mouths against me as a raging and roaring lion. I have been poured out like water, and all my bones have been spread apart. My heart has become like wax, it is melted in the midst of my inward parts. My strength is dried up like the potsherd, and my tongue is cleaving to my jaws, and to the dust of death you are appointing me. For dogs have surrounded me, a crowd of evil ones have encircled me, piercing my hands and my feet. I count all my bones. They look and they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my raiment they cast lots. But you, O YaHuWaH, do not be far off. O my strength, hasten to help me. Deliver my life from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion and from the horns of the wild beast. You have answered me. I make known your name to my brothers. In the midst of the assembly, I praise you. This is clearly speaking of Yahushua HaMashiach. This is a song of King David that was written prophetically. There has never been a time that King David was pointed to death and killed and pierced in his hands and his feet. Never. But what he is speaking of is this exact moment when Yahushua HaMashiach is on the stake and he cries out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my El, why have you forsaken me? It's not because Yahuwah had turned his back on his son, as people have claimed. That is not the reason. The reason he says this is because it is a famous song of King David, and all the people should know when he says, Ali, Ali, lama sabachthani, remember the words of the song. Remember the words of the song. They pierced my hands and my feet. Let's keep on going. Let's look at YaHuWaH now, because John 19 should be paralleled with Psalm chapter 22. It works perfect. In YaHuWaH in John chapter 19:23, it says, Then the soldiers, when they impaled Yahushua, took his outer garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and the inner garment, but the inner garment was without seam, woven from the top in one piece. So they said to each other, Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, in order that the scripture might be filled, which says, They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. We just read this in Psalm 22, said the exact same thing. The soldiers, therefore, indeed did this. So they literally did this. When Yahushua said, The dogs have surrounded me, when Yahushua himself said that the Romans were dogs. I mean, it's a hard pill to swallow for some people. But the reality is, throughout the scriptures, the Goyim, the Gentiles, are always likened unto wild beasts, especially things like dogs. And here it says, The dogs have surrounded me, and that they had cast lots for my raiment. They divided my garments among them. For my clothing they cast lots. The soldiers indeed did this to Yahushua. In verse 25 it says, And by the stake of Yahushua stood his mother, and his mother's sister Miriam, the wife of Clopha, and Miriam from Magdala. Then Yahushua, seeing his mother and the taught one that he loved, which was YaHuWaH or John, he said, Behold, he said to this woman, Woman, see your son. Then to the taught one he said, See your mother. And from that hour that taught one took her into his own home. And after this, Yahushua, knowing that all had been accomplished, in order that the scripture might be filled, said, I thirst. A bowl of sour wine stood there, and they filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on hyssop and held it to his mouth. So when Yahushua took the sour wine, he said, It has been accomplished. And bowing his head, he gave up his ruach. Therefore, since it was the preparation day, that the body should not remain on the stake of the Sabbath, for that Shabbat was a high one. Again, Rabbi Yoma de Shabbata. The Yahudim asked Pilate to have their legs broken, that they be taken away. Therefore the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who was impaled with him. But when they came to Yahushua and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and instantly blood and water came out. And he who has seen has witnessed, and his witness is true. And he knows what he is speaking is the truth, in order that you might believe. For this took place in order for the scripture to be filled, that not one of his bones should be broken. Again, this is in Psalm 22. Also, the Passover lamb could not have a bone broken. And again, another scripture says, they shall look on him whom they have pierced. This is in the book of Zechariah. It literally says, they will look on me, which is, it says, look on me, Aleph Tall, whom they pierced. In Mark chapter 15, verse 37, it says, and Yahushua cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last, and the veil of the dwelling place was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the captain, who was standing opposite him, saw that he cried out like this and breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the son of Elohim. And when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Shabbat, Yahusuf of Ramathaim, a prominent council member, who himself was also waiting for the reign of Elohim, came boldly and went into Pilate and asked for the body of Yahushua. In Luke chapter 23, verse 46, and it says, and crying out with a loud voice, Yahushua said, Father, into your hands I commit my ruach. And having said this, he breathed his last. And the captain, seeing what took place, praised Elohim, saying, truly this man was righteous. And when all the crowds who had gathered to the sight saw what had took place, they all beat their chest and went away. In verse 54 it says, and it was the preparation day, and the Sabbath was approaching. And the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. And having returned, they prepared spices and perfume, and they rested on the Shabbat. They rested on the Sabbath according to the command, even after his death. And you see that his followers kept on keeping the Shabbat after his death, burial, and his resurrection. There was no stopping of the observance of the Passover. Another thing that people have to understand is that on this day, the day that Yahushua gave up his life, on the day of the Passover, at the very hour that the first Passover lamb was to be sacrificed, that the lamb was then to be tied to a long stake made out of pomegranate wood. And there it would be roasted on that stake. It would be roasted with fire, and it was bound by its legs. Two legs, the front two legs and the back two legs were raised up and back and tied to this stake and roasted in fire. A picture of Yahushua nailed to the stake by his hands and by his feet. And then we see that when he dies, they have to hurry up and get his body because the high Sabbath is approaching and the Passover meal has got to be eaten this night. And so they're rushing to hurry up, and they lay him in a tomb where nobody had yet laid. And this was done by Yahusuf of Ramathaim. And we see that this is a picture of purging the leaven, because the leaven has to be purged in order to eat the Passover. And Yahushua at this moment is a picture of taking on the sicknesses and the infirmities and the sins of his people. And now he's a picture of leaven himself, and his body is purged. So at this time, Yahushua fulfilled not only the Passover, but also the feast of unleavened bread, because he was a picture of the leaven that was being purged, purging the sin from his people. Now, if we go to Yirmiyahu, to the Tanakh, to the prophet Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah 11:19, he said, but I was like a gentle lamb brought to the slaughter, and I did not know that they had plotted against me, saying, let us destroy the tree and its fruit, and let us cut him off from the land of the living, and let his name be remembered no more. There's an acronym that has been used by those who despise Yahushua, and it is the word Yeshu. And Yeshu is an acronym that literally means may his name and memorial be blotted out forever. And here Yirmiyahu is speaking, and he says he was like a tender lamb brought to the slaughter. And they said, let us destroy him and blot out his name so that it's no longer remembered. And he is prophetically speaking of Yahushua. Now, of course, he's speaking about himself also, who has been brought before a lamb, before these people who were in high places who wanted to destroy Yirmiyahu, the great prophet. But he is speaking in a foreshadowing of Yahushua HaMashiach. And we know this if we go to the great prophet Isaiah, Yeshayahu. If we start in chapter 52, if we look at verse 13, it says, see, my servant shall work wisely. He shall be exalted and be lifted up and be very high. As many as were astonished at you, so the disfigurement beyond any man's, and his form beyond the sons of men. He shall likewise startle many nations, or goyim. Sovereigns will shut their mouths at him. For what had not been recounted to them, they shall see. And what they had not heard, they shall understand. If we continue reading, because there are no chapters and verses in the Hebrew, it says, who has believed our report? And to whom was the arm of YaHuWaH revealed? This is calling the servant of YaHuWaH the arm of YaHuWaH. For he grew up before him as a tender plant. Who? The servant of YaHuWaH, the arm of YaHuWaH, grew up as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form nor splendor that we should look upon him, nor appearance that we should desire him. Despised and rejected by men, a man of pains and knowing sickness, and one from whom the face is hidden. Being despised, we did not consider him. Truly he has borne our sicknesses and carried our pains, that we reckoned him smitten, stricken by Elohim and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our crookedness. The chastisement of our shalom, of our peace, was upon him. And by his stripes we are healed. We all like sheep went away. Each one has returned to his own way. And Yahuwah has laid on him the crookedness of us all. He was oppressed and was afflicted, but he did not open his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is silent. He did not open his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and for his generation who considered that he should be cut off from the land of the living. Who? The servant of YaHuWaH. The right hand of YaHuWaH was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. And he was appointed a burial site with the wrong, and with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was deceit in his mouth. But Yahuwah was pleased to crush him. He laid sickness on him, and when he made himself an offering for guilt, he would see a seed, he would prolong his days, and the pleasure of Yahuwah prosper in his hand. He would see the result of his suffering and his life and be satisfied. Through his knowledge, my righteous servant makes many righteous, and he bears their crookedness. Therefore, I give him a portion among the great, and he divides the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his being unto death. And he was counted with the transgressors, and he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. And here we see clearly the suffering servant Messiah who was to come and who is to come. Yahushua HaMashiach was nailed to the stake as a picture of the Lamb of YaHuWaH, the right hand of YaHuWaH. But the scriptures tell us that he will conquer, that the prosperity of YaHuWaH will be in his hand, and that he will rule and reign forever. So he is the Lamb of YaHuWaH, but he is also the coming Lion of the tribe of Yehudah who will rule and reign. Again, just to recap a few things before we go to a couple of quotes really quick and end this teaching. I want to just refresh your memory with the idea of the Korban Tamid, the everyday slaughter offering, the standing slaughter offering that happens at the 3rd hour and at the 9th hour. Because if we look at the scriptures, you will see that oftentimes at the times of the sacrifices and at the times of the prayers, you will see that the apostles, the shlechem of Yahushua, kept the set apart prayers, the 3 prayers that happen every single day that link up with the standing prayers, the Tamid offerings, and these are called the Amidah, which literally mean the standing prayers. Amidah means standing. And the reason that these are important, and I'm not talking about today's version in rabbinical Phariseeism, but I'm talking about what Yahushua and his taught ones did in the first century, because this was echoed in the life of Daniel. Daniel the prophet was thrown into the lion's den because he would not cease from praying towards Jerusalem, towards Yerushalayim 3 times a day at the time of the sacrifice of the 2 sacrifices for the morning and the evening, and the time of the selection for the evening slaughter offering, which again was the 3rd and the 6th and the 9th hour. And all these times are important throughout the Brit Chadasha. So just to recap, Yahushua was nailed to the stake at the time of the first prayer, the time of the first slaughter offering. The entire land grew dark at the time of the second prayer of the day, at the time when the second lamb was to be selected. And at the 9th hour, the time when the Passover lamb and every lamb every single day for the evening was sacrificed, Yahushua HaMashiach gave up his life. And this is why it's so important, because in the book of Revelation, over and over and over, you'll see that it says, I saw a lamb having been slain, and he was standing. It's literally saying that he was Amid. He was Amid, which means standing, comes from Amidah, comes from Tamid, which means perpetual. He's the perpetual slaughter offering that is standing forever. That is what the revelation is. Now, really quickly, I want to leave you with a thought about the early Nazarene from a source that people call the early church fathers, from Eusebius. And Eusebius writes about a man named Polycrates, who the Roman assemblies called the church or the Kirke. They literally were imposing the idea of celebrating Ishtar or Easter during the time of Polycrates. And this is what he says to the leaders in Rome in the church history in the writing of Eusebius. He says, we observe the exact day, neither adding nor taking away, for in Asia also great lights have fallen asleep, which shall rise again in the day of Yahuwah's coming. And when he shall come with esteem from heaven, and shall seek out the saints, or the Kodashim, the set apart ones. Among these are Philip, one of the 12 apostles, who fell asleep in Hierapolis, and his 2 aged virgin daughters, and another daughter who lived in the Ruach HaKodesh, and now rests at Ephesus. And moreover, Yahuchanan, who is John, who is both a witness and a teacher, who reclined upon the bosom of the master, and being a Kohen or a priest, he wore the sacerdotal plate. He fell asleep at Ephesus. And Polycarp in Smyrna, who was bishop and martyr, and Thraces, bishop and martyr of Eumania, who fell asleep at Smyrna. Why need I mention the bishop and martyr Sagaris, who fell asleep in Laodicea, or the Baruch Pyphorus, or Melito, the eunuch who lived altogether in the Ruach HaKodesh, and who lives in Sardis, awaiting the episcopate from Shemayim, from heaven, when he shall raise from the dead. All these observe the 14th day of the Passover, according to the Bashar, to the glad tidings, deviating in no respect, but following the rule of Emunah, of belief. And I also, Polycrates, the least of you all, do according to the tradition of my relatives, some of whom I have closely followed. For 7 of my relatives were bishops or overseers, and I am the 8th. And my relatives always observe the day when the people put away the leaven. I therefore, brethren, who have lived 65 years in the Master, have met with the brothers throughout the world, and have gone through every kadosh scripture. I am not afraid by terrifying words, for those greater than I have said, we ought to obey Elohim rather than men. And this is in the book of Acts. Polycrates was a student of Yahuchanan, who is John, the beloved Talmud, the beloved student of Yahushua HaMashiach. And here, if we examine the quote-unquote early church fathers, we see that the Nazarene, those believers in Yahushua, were still observing the Passover. And Polycrates was one of the Nazarene, and he clearly kept the Passover and said that he deviated in no respect. So if anyone, any man comes along and tells you we're not supposed to observe the Passover, he is going not only against Yahushua and Shaul and throughout the Torah and the prophets and the writings and everything that we know of as Kodesh Scripture, but he is going against the blood of the martyrs of Yahushua HaMashiach. He is going against the blood of Yahuwah's people who said that we should observe the Passover and said that it is right that we fear Yahuwah and not man. And not man. When Polycrates said that those greater than him have said it is right that we should fear before Yahuwah and not before man, if you read the context of what was being said in the book of Acts, their lives were at stake when they made the statement. In other words, it does not matter if your life is on the line, you obey Yahuwah Elohim, you do not listen to man. And Yahuwah Elohim has said, observe the Passover. His students observed the Passover. Shaul observed the Passover. All the righteous prophets of old observed the Passover. We are supposed to observe the Passover because Yahushua, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. So I pray that this revelation will open your eyes, open your heart to the true Lamb of YaHuWaH, who takes away the sin from his people. And I pray that you will have the emunah, the belief, and the endurance to finish this race in the belief of Yahushua, our Passover Lamb. Shalom, shalom.
Mighty is the King who reigns. Great and awesome is his name. He is the Lamb upon the throne, and blessed